I'm Lucas Grant, 33, former captain in the Oregon National Guard. After nearly a decade serving across bases from Fort Bliss to Kandahar, I was finally heading home for Christmas. Not permanently, just a brief, sanctioned leave. Enough to recharge. Enough, maybe, to see if anything had changed. I'd spent the last few years on a classified logistics command assignment. Nothing flashy, just rows of data, convoy audits, and security briefings that never made headlines. But I liked the structure, the predictability, the absence of hidden motives. Out there, the rules were written down, the objectives clear. Back home, things were never that simple. The town I was returning to, Caldera, hadn't changed much since I left. A blue-collar town carved into the hills of Central Oregon, with damp pine air and a main street lined with realtors, diner chains, and window displays that hadn't been updated in years. The kind of town that judged you quietly and remembered everything you tried to forget. My flight was booked, bags packed, each gift labeled neatly for the family members I hadn't spoken to in months. Then the message came, brief, final. There was no anger in it, just absence. A sharp, sudden vacuum of belonging. I stared at the screen for a long time, rereading it as if tone would materialize on the fourth or fifth pass. But the meaning stayed the same. The door was shut, and it wasn't me who closed it. I didn't reply right away. When I finally did, it was with one word. I didn't expect a response, and none came. What unsettled me wasn't the rejection, it was the clarity. Like someone had finally admitted something that had always been true. I didn't cancel my leave. I just rerouted it. Instead of the Grant family home in East Caldera, I booked a modest rental in the outskirts, an aging A-frame cabin overlooking a frozen creek, surrounded by pines that creaked in the wind like they were trying to speak. The driveway was gravel, the heater moody, and the furniture thrifted and mismatched. But it was mine for the next 2 weeks. I arrived just before sunset on a Tuesday, dragging my duffel across the icy path, knowing full well this wasn't going to be the kind of holiday I had imagined. The next morning I woke early, restless. Old habits, drills, inspections, orders had trained me into patterns of wakefulness I couldn't unlearn. I made coffee, sat by the small window, and watched the woods. Then I drove into town. Caldera's central stretch hadn't changed much. Still the same storefronts with hand-painted signage, still the same cold faces warmed by thin smiles. I walked into the local market to stock up on supplies. Halfway down the cereal aisle, I heard someone call my name. Her name was Dana Carlson. We went to high school together. She used to run track and edit the yearbook. Now she looked like most people here, older, settled, guarded. She asked if I was back for good. I said I was just on leave. She tilted her head, confused. Said she saw my dad at the Rotary meeting last week, and he never mentioned I was coming home. I said it was last minute. She nodded, slowly, in that way people do when they've already filled in the blanks themselves. Later that day, I got a call from Aunt Ruth, my father's younger sister. She was the only one in the family who had stayed in touch over the years. Her voice was calm, but there was a texture to it, like she was measuring every word. She told me she'd heard I was back in town and thought I should know something wasn't right. Not with my dad, and not with the company. Northline Infrastructure, the family business, had been growing rapidly in the past 3 years, despite the downturn in state contracts. She didn't know specifics, but she'd seen things. Equipment disappearing from yards without invoices. Employees let go without reason. Projects taken on with timelines and scopes that didn't make sense. I didn't say much. I thanked her, told her I appreciated the heads up. But her words stayed with me. 2 days later, I found myself at the county records office, a place I hadn't been since helping my father file a zoning application back when I was 18. I pulled every public filing Northline had submitted over the past 5 years. At first, nothing stood out. Standard permits, contractor certifications, bid applications. But then I noticed a shift. Around late 2019, the company's contracts pivoted sharply. Instead of local infrastructure projects, they were bidding successfully on federal contracts. Not just any contracts, but military grade, communication centers, secure storage, modular barracks. That would have required access, security clearances, someone vetted and approved through a federal contractor screening process. I flipped through a 2021 pre-qualification document filed under a project in Kansas. Page 6 listed a Lucas G. Grant as an executive advisor with Tier 2 clearance. It was my name, my rank, my deployment history, but the signature at the bottom wasn't mine. I didn't act immediately. I sat with it. Let the snow fall, let the silence thicken. There's a particular kind of stillness when you begin to suspect your family has crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. That night, I rechecked my personal email. Nothing unusual. Then I opened the old inbox I used during my first years in the Guard, one that had long since gone dormant. A new login alert pinged. IP address, East Caldera. Date, 4 months ago. I changed the password, locked the account, forwarded the logs to myself. No names, no confession, just patterns. The next morning, I drove to the edge of town to see Mitch, a retired contractor I used to know. We hadn't spoken in years, but he'd always been loyal to Northline and my father, until it seemed he wasn't. Mitch didn't say much, just asked if I wanted to see the yard. He walked me around slowly, pointing out gaps in inventory, missing machinery, half-finished projects. "Something's off," he said, not looking me in the eye. "And if I were you, I'd keep asking questions." That evening, someone left a manila envelope on the hood of my car. No return address. Inside, photocopies of contract summaries, subcontractor payments, and an internal memo referencing a veteran status exemption that had allowed Northline to bypass certain bid vetting procedures. The memo named me directly. I kept the lights on all night after that. Not out of fear, out of calculation. I needed to know if someone was watching. No cars idled nearby, no eyes behind curtains, but I didn't sleep. The following day, I stopped by the public library, logged into a secure network, and ran my name through the federal contractor verification system. My identity was tied to 3 active bids. My service record had been used to validate Northline's qualifications. My file had been cloned. Back at the cabin, I tried to make sense of the pattern. My father had always said Northline was built on integrity, that our name meant something. That was his favorite phrase, our name, as if it belonged to him more than it ever belonged to me. I pored over the files, dates, names, job codes. The forgery wasn't just clumsy, it was calculated. Whoever did it knew exactly when I'd been deployed, what level of access I'd been granted, what paperwork to replicate. At some point, the boundary between family and liability had collapsed. By nightfall, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. Someone had started parking a black SUV 2 driveways down, unmarked. No plates visible. It stayed there for 20 minutes, then left. Returned the next day. Same pattern. I didn't call anyone. Not yet. I waited. The pieces weren't all there. Not yet. But something had shifted. The silence around me was no longer quiet. It was loaded. And that meant one thing. Someone else had just realized I was home. I started waking up earlier than usual. Not because I needed to. There was no reveille in the woods, no briefings, no formations, but because my mind began organizing the days into quiet segments. There was a sense of inventory behind each motion. Coffee first, then notes. A slow sweep of the driveway. A mental clock tracking the appearance and disappearance of the SUV, which now parked in different locations but never far. A rhythm was establishing itself, and I let it. I no longer kept my phone on my nightstand. It stayed powered off in a drawer, wrapped in tinfoil. A precaution. Maybe unnecessary, but that wasn't the point. The point was control. Every morning, I went into town under a different pretense. Sometimes for groceries, sometimes to drop by the library or hardware store, sometimes for walks that ended nowhere. I spoke to no one unless I had to. I returned every glance with neutral eye contact, held just long enough to convey awareness. I made no attempt to disguise myself, yet there was something about moving with deliberate normalcy that made me harder to pin down. One afternoon, I stopped by a diner off Route 6, the kind that serves pie with every combo and still takes cash. I sat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and pretended to read. The man in the booth across from me pretended not to look. We were both very good at pretending. The dance of 2 people not acknowledging each other was old choreography. Back at the cabin, I rearranged furniture, not for comfort, but for angles. Clean lines of sight to the door, the windows, the corners where sound collects. I moved the dining table closer to the front window and adjusted a mirror to catch movement along the porch. There were better tools for this, sure, but improvisation had its own kind of precision. If someone meant to find something, they would. I just preferred to know when. I pulled all the physical documents I'd been collecting into a single binder: public records, contracts, envelopes left anonymously, handwritten notes from people who didn't want to be remembered. I inserted plastic tabs to mark the dates. I highlighted redundancies. A pattern was forming, not in what was done, but in how carelessly it was concealed. That was the most revealing part. It wasn't meant to be invisible. It was meant to go unnoticed by someone who had no reason to look. Each evening, I drove the long way home, changing routes. It added 20 minutes to the trip, but it gave me a sense of dimension, of how far visibility could stretch before it started folding back in on itself. Sometimes I'd stop by the lake, leave the headlights on, and watch the reflection of trees shake in the wind-blown surface. It helped to sit there, to think in wider arcs. Occasionally, I scribbled details in a notebook, things I couldn't prove yet, but didn't want to forget. A license plate that circled the same blocks near my cabin 2 nights in a row. A delivery van parked outside the Northline office on a federal holiday. A sequence of calls to a DC number, logged in metadata I had no legal right to access, but found anyway. My father's name came up twice in local procurement bulletins, once in relation to a bid that had been withdrawn after an anonymous tip. The timing matched an internal meeting I'd found referenced in the margins of a printed project summary. Someone had tried to cover it up, poorly. Redacted lines, printed over faint signatures. Names whited out with enough pressure to tear the page. In a storage bin beneath the cabin's staircase, I found an old wireless printer the previous tenant had left behind. I plugged it in, ran diagnostics, and connected it to a temporary device loaded with only the files I needed. I printed duplicates of everything and sealed them in envelopes marked by date and subject. Then I drove them to a post office 2 towns over and shipped them to a legal contact in Virginia. 1 envelope each day. No return address, no pattern. The weather changed that week. Snow began falling in sheets, soft but persistent. The roads emptied earlier, the town lights seemed duller, and people moved with a slower, more cautious rhythm. Inside the cabin, the chill crept through window edges and under the doors, but I kept the heat low. Noise carries in cold air. I learned that overseas, but it applies everywhere. There were moments where I allowed myself to reflect, briefly, not with regret, but observation, on how quickly a name could be used without permission, on how easily loyalty becomes a commodity, on the subtle ways silence accumulates weight in a family until it folds everything else beneath it. I thought of the dinners where I'd sat through my father's monologues about legacy, stability, the value of hard work, how those speeches had always seemed directed at someone else, someone I was supposed to become but never was. I visited the courthouse again under the guise of tracing a land record. I left with 3 building permits and a printout of recent Northline amendments to contractor agreements. Most of it was boilerplate, but buried in one file was a technical appendix referencing personnel access, a clause that, when cross-checked with my military service record, triggered more questions than answers. I made notes, backed up files, stored things twice, once physically, once in encrypted form. Each task was simple. None of them required emotion. That was the advantage. I could move without hesitation, without reflection. The truth didn't need urgency. It just needed room. On the 7th night, I saw the SUV again. This time, parked directly across from the cabin. Engine off, lights dimmed. I didn't look out the window. I turned off the interior lights and went about making tea. Then I sat by the fire and opened the binder. No reaction, no escalation, just stillness. If someone wanted a response, they'd have to ask for one. I didn't notify the authorities. Not yet. Not when the weight of evidence wasn't enough to warrant action, but too much to ignore. The line between anticipation and confrontation was razor thin, and I wasn't ready to step across. But I was close. The day began without ceremony. Just snow, light at first, then heavier. I drank coffee as usual, went over the documents again, reviewed the chain of custody I'd built over the past week. It was time. There wasn't a dramatic moment of decision, no rush of vindication, no righteous indignation. Just an endpoint reached, methodically. By noon, I was sitting in a neutral federal building on the south side of the city, a quiet room with bare walls and fluorescent lighting. Across from me sat 2 investigators from the Office of Inspector General, along with a legal officer from the Department of Defense. I submitted my file, including the forged clearance forms, the shipment records, the procurement overlaps, the versioned logs of access requests tied to my military ID. I answered questions with measured clarity. I declined to speculate. I provided dates, not opinions. When asked if I believed my credentials had been used knowingly and without consent, I confirmed the misuse. When asked if I had ever authorized or signed anything permitting Northline to use my IMA record, I confirmed I had not. I didn't need to guess motive. That wasn't my role. The investigators listened, took notes, marked documents. One of them, older precise, looked at me longer than the others. His silence suggested familiarity with this type of betrayal. Not uncommon, perhaps, but rarely so systematic. By the end of the meeting, my military records were flagged for protective status, and a formal audit of Northline infrastructure had been opened. A memo would be circulated to suspend all active federal contracts pending further review. I was advised to remain locally available. I had already planned to. That evening, I returned to the cabin. I turned my phone on for the first time in days. A flood of messages poured in. Calls, voicemails, emails. The tone shifted from polite inquiry to escalating urgency. My name had surfaced in a redacted DOJ inquiry leaked to a regional journalist. Within hours, the quiet town of Caldera was murmuring louder than it had in years. My mother called first, then my brother, then Ruth. My father didn't call. Instead, someone from his legal team left a voicemail requesting a meeting. I did not respond. The next morning, a local news van was parked just outside the old Northline headquarters. The building's logo had been covered by a black tarp. Employees stood in clusters outside, coats pulled tight, expressions tight with confusion and restrained panic. I didn't approach. I watched from a distance, noting who walked in and who didn't. Later that day, Ruth showed up unannounced at the cabin. She carried a slim file folder and wore a coat I remembered from years ago. She didn't sit. She placed the folder on the table and left. Inside were scanned copies of internal Northline memos, printed emails, and an original contract submission packet that bore my forged signature in 2 separate places. Her silence was the loudest thing in the room that day. Around dusk, I received a call from a legal liaison representing a government contractor integrity unit. The voice was calm, rehearsed. They informed me that federal agents had requested a protective review of my personnel file and security credentials. Northline's executive contracts had been frozen. Certain high-value assets were being seized for forensic investigation. That night, the SUV didn't return. At the hospital, my father suffered what was described as a cardiac event. He was moved to the ICU for observation. My brother called again, this time from a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was scattered, a mixture of confusion, half apologies, and attempts at rationalization. He referenced an unsigned document, a misunderstanding, something he claimed he hadn't known about until it was too late. The next morning, the Northline website went dark. The domain redirected to a placeholder message, under federal review. A press release followed, terse and devoid of accountability. It referenced compliance, cooperation, ongoing commitment to ethical standards. No names were mentioned, but everyone in town knew who was behind it. By midweek, subpoenas had been issued. The County Courier published a front-page headline, Federal Agents Investigate Local Contractor Over Military Credential Fraud. Beneath it, a photo of the Northline sign half buried in snow. No byline, just the story. People reacted in expected ways. Some sent cautious messages of support, cloaked in neutrality. Others avoided eye contact in public, unsure of which version of the story to believe. There were those who saw me as a whistleblower, and those who saw me as a traitor. It made little difference. The truth had no allegiance. My inbox filled with requests from journalists, nonprofits, even attorneys representing other veterans. I answered none of them. I spent most of my time documenting, organizing the narrative from beginning to end, not to publish, just to understand it clearly, line by line. I tracked every date, every detail, every small decision that had led to this point. I didn't need vindication. I needed accuracy. One morning, while walking along the frozen creek behind the cabin, I saw a trail of boot prints not my own. They led to the edge of the water, stopped, then turned back. I didn't follow them. I stood in the cold and noted their pattern, their hesitation. The subtle stagger in stride. At the edge of collapse, everything slows. People move like they're under observation, even when they're not. That's the part no one prepares for. Not the exposure, but the silence that follows. I continued waking early. I continued cataloging. I continued walking the long way into town. Nothing had changed, but everything was different. There were no more calls from the SUV, no more sudden deliveries, just the sound of systems folding in on themselves, piece by piece, without needing me to say another word. The days that followed moved with a different kind of quiet. Not the uneasy hush that had hovered over the cabin for weeks, but a more grounded, intentional silence. One by one, the noise faded. The SUV never returned. The calls slowed. The tension that had stretched across every hour began to loosen, not because anything had been resolved, but because momentum had shifted. The town absorbed the news in predictable fragments. Local papers ran updates with cautious wording. Headlines spoke of investigations and regulatory reviews, but never named the people involved. Still, in a place like Caldera, names weren't necessary. Context filled itself in. At the diner, they began greeting me again, not warmly, not with apology, but with acknowledgement. The same people who had once avoided eye contact now offered brief nods. The cashier who had once stumbled over my name handed me coffee without hesitation. I accepted it without commentary. Some gestures were quieter. A retired Air Force mechanic slid a folded note under my napkin while I sat at the bar, eating alone. No name, no signature. Just a sentence written in block letters. Took guts, don't let them rewrite it. I folded it into my wallet without a word. A week passed, then another. The snow thickened and the cabin grew colder, but I stayed. I had no reason to leave. I split firewood in the early mornings, made lists I didn't always follow, checked in periodically with the liaison at the Office of Military Legal Affairs. The review was still active. Depositions were being scheduled. I had done what I needed to do. What came next was out of my hands. Letters began to arrive. Not many, but enough. One from the State University's Veterans Outreach Program, asking if I would consider consulting on policy adjustments. Another from a congressional aide requesting an off-the-record conversation about contractor oversight. I responded selectively. No promises. No interviews. But the tone had changed. I was no longer being investigated. I was being invited. Captain Tessa Lynn, someone I'd trained with early in my career, sent a brief encrypted message through official channels. She had heard what happened. She commended the clarity of my actions. She said most wouldn't have handled it so directly. I believed her. I just didn't know how to do it any other way. One afternoon, I received a letter from the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General. It confirmed that my record had been cleared of any association with Northline Infrastructure's contracts. The findings confirmed misuse of identity, unauthorized access to credentials, and intent to defraud federal procurement systems. The final paragraph expressed appreciation for my cooperation and professionalism during the investigation. It wasn't celebratory. It was factual. I preferred it that way. Back in Caldera, Ruth began organizing a small veterans gathering at the town hall. She asked if I would speak. I declined. Instead, I offered to help set up the chairs. On the day of the event, I arrived early, carried in folding tables, adjusted the thermostat, and stayed until the lights were turned off. No one asked for more. Somewhere in that rhythm, people began to see me differently. Not as the defector who left the family business, not as the soldier who disappeared into the system, but as someone who had come back with something sharper than nostalgia. I visited the community college one afternoon, walking its narrow halls, looking at bulletin boards lined with outdated flyers. The dean's office had my name on a contact list pinned by a thumbtack. A handwritten note beside it said, "Pending confirmation." I didn't remove it. The library started holding weekly resume workshops for veterans. I dropped in once, sat quietly, listened to the questions being asked. When one of the younger attendees asked about translating military experience into civilian terms, the coordinator pointed toward me. I didn't speak right away. When I did, I offered frameworks, not stories. A few weeks later, the Department of Veterans Affairs sent an informal request for consultation. They were reviewing policy recommendations around identity misuse for service members in private sector contracts. They asked if I would review the preliminary draft. I accepted, under the condition of anonymity. The roads began to thaw in March. The lake softened at the edges, trees moved differently in the wind, less brittle. The cabin remained my base, though I started spending time in the town more often. People approached with less caution. A few even asked for advice on paperwork, on navigating legal systems, on protecting themselves from being used without consent. I offered what I knew. My father remained under house arrest, his health stabilized, but his movement restricted. I didn't visit. There was nothing more to say. My mother had moved out quietly, settling into a small rental on the west side of town. She'd begun volunteering at the library. We saw each other once, briefly. She looked older, but lighter. No words passed between us. It was enough. My brother left the company entirely. He filed for bankruptcy a month later. Rumors circulated that he'd moved to Portland, trying to rebuild under a different name. I didn't follow up. Eventually, the federal proceedings transitioned into the sentencing phase. I wasn't required to attend, so I didn't. I received a summary afterward: sanctions, financial restitution, and a multi-year prohibition on holding any executive role in a government-affiliated entity. It was a formal closure. Nothing more. One morning, I woke to find a small envelope slid under my cabin door. No stamp, no name. Inside was a single Polaroid of me as a teenager, sitting on the hood of my father's old truck. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, was a date. No message. I stared at it for a long time. Then I placed it in the drawer with the rest of the sealed evidence I no longer needed. I had no plans to stay in Caldera permanently, but I wasn't in a hurry to leave. There were things being built, quiet things. A new veterans advocacy group had begun forming. A local attorney I'd met offered to help register it. There was talk of grant funding, of partnerships with national networks. I contributed where I could. I let others take credit. Each evening, I walked the edge of the lake, watching the thaw spread inch by inch. The sound of ice cracking beneath the surface reminded me of the silence that comes before something gives way. Not an end, just a shift. I didn't need to be seen anymore. I had been seen enough. What mattered now was what would stand once the noise had passed. The invitation arrived in a plain envelope. No insignia, no letterhead, just my name, typed neatly, and a return address from Arlington. Inside was a formal request to speak at a roundtable symposium hosted by the Office of Military Oversight and Civil Military Affairs. The topic was ethical boundaries in veteran-linked federal contracting. My name was listed beneath the panel heading, When Identity Becomes Leverage. I reread the invitation 3 times before setting it aside. There was no pressure to respond immediately, but the language made it clear. They wanted a perspective shaped not by theory, but by endurance. I didn't commit right away. I took my time. 2 weeks later, I stood at the back of a wood-paneled room overlooking the Potomac. The space was quiet, reserved, no cameras, no press. Just policy advisors, veterans, legal analysts, and a handful of agency representatives whose names I recognized from previous correspondence. Most were older, measured. A few were my age, their uniforms traded for tailored jackets and quiet eyes. I was introduced with restraint. A brief biography, stripped of ornament. No mention of the scandal. Just my service history, my role as an inadvertent case study, and my decision to come forward when silence would have been easier. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't read from notes. I talked about structure, how the military teaches you to trust systems, to follow chain of command, to believe in accountability. Then I talked about what happens when those structures are repurposed by people who see identity not as service, but as currency. I didn't name my father. I didn't need to. I described the slow unraveling of trust within a family when truth becomes inconvenient. I outlined the legal mechanisms that allowed a fraudulent contract to take root in the shadow of my career. I spoke clearly, plainly, and only about what I had verified. I didn't speculate. The room stayed quiet throughout. No one interrupted. Afterward, a woman from the Office of Government Ethics approached me with a printed draft of new policy recommendations. She asked if I would review them before they went before the Senate subcommittee. I said yes, not because I wanted to shape policy, but because I understood now what could happen when no one did. Back in Oregon, spring had softened the landscape. The ice was gone from the lake. New growth edged the hills. The cabin, once a place of withdrawal, now felt like a point of origin. I kept the wood stove lit in the evenings, not out of necessity, but out of habit. I received a letter from the Caldera School District asking if I would consider mentoring students in their new civic responsibility program. The coordinator had heard I was in town for a while and thought I might have something to offer. I said I'd think about it. The truth was, I'd already drafted notes, questions, case studies, exercises, nothing official, just frameworks. The university published a short article about veterans in leadership, highlighting non-traditional paths. My name appeared in a sidebar, along with two others. The caption beneath my photo read, Lucas Grant, returned, recovered, redefined. I didn't keep a copy, but someone sent one to Ruth, and she mailed it to me anyway. There were no more hearings to attend, no more lawyers to meet. The investigation had closed, the penalties had been assigned, restitution was underway. Northline would never recover its name, but that was no longer my concern. The burden of legacy had lifted. Some nights, I walked the perimeter of the lake under fading light, tracing the path I'd taken countless times before. The air was warmer, the stillness less tense. I no longer checked behind me. The silence had returned to being just silence. One morning, I found a note pinned to the cabin door. A child's handwriting. Crude block letters on ruled paper. It said simply, "My uncle says you did something brave." No name, no return address, just a sentence. I kept that one. If anyone had asked me what I'd gained, I'm not sure I could have answered. There were no trophies, no accolades. But there was a weight that had lifted, almost imperceptibly, like waking one morning and realizing you no longer had to defend your place in the world. Some truths demand to be known, not to punish, but to clarify. Some fights, when faced head-on, don't end in victory or defeat, but in the quiet arrival of something stronger than approval, peace. And sometimes, the clearest measure of who we've become is the silence we no longer carry. Sometimes the battles we fight aren't loud. They don't unfold in courtrooms or on stages. They begin in silence, in unanswered messages, in glances that look away, in names spoken without permission. And when you choose to stand your ground, not with anger, but with clarity, something shifts. Not just around you, but within you. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about returning, about walking back into a space that once rejected you, not to prove anything, but to reclaim what was always yours, the right to be seen truthfully. There was no dramatic vindication, no final applause, only a quiet series of acknowledgments, a nod from someone who once doubted, a handwritten note from a stranger, a place at the table you never asked for but were finally offered. And maybe that's the kind of justice that matters most, the kind that doesn't scream but endures, that doesn't erase the harm but keeps it from continuing. If you've ever felt dismissed, misused, or silenced by those closest to you, I hope this story reminds you. You don't have to fight loudly to be heard. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to stay calm, gather the truth, and let it speak for itself. What would it mean for you to be seen not for what they expect, but for who you truly are?